When you evaluate governance and identify gaps, overlaps, and weak signals, the next step is where governance either becomes real or becomes a decorative exercise, because findings only matter if the enterprise can close them in a way that sticks. Issue remediation in governance is not the same as fixing a single bug or writing a new policy, because governance issues usually involve patterns of decision-making, unclear ownership, weak oversight, or inconsistent controls that will reappear unless the underlying cause is addressed. The goal of remediation is twofold: close the specific governance gap that was discovered and prevent the same class of failure from recurring in a slightly different form next quarter. That prevention focus is what separates mature governance from a cycle of endless firefighting, where the enterprise keeps solving symptoms while root causes remain. For beginners, it helps to think of remediation as the enterprise learning how to improve itself, because a governance framework that cannot improve will slowly become irrelevant as the environment changes. This episode will make remediation feel like a repeatable discipline with clear ownership, priorities, and follow-through, rather than a vague promise that something will be fixed. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A clear definition of a governance remediation issue is a documented problem in the governance system that affects alignment, value delivery, risk management, compliance readiness, or accountability. The issue might be missing decision rights for a category of risk acceptances, unclear ownership of a critical information asset, inconsistent use of business cases before funding, or an exception process that is routinely bypassed. What makes it a governance issue is that it affects enterprise-wide behavior and outcomes, not just a single system or a single project. Governance remediation therefore aims to change how the enterprise makes decisions and oversees outcomes so that the issue does not regenerate. Beginners often think remediation is mainly about doing more work, but governance remediation is more about changing the structure that determines what work happens and how it is controlled. That means remediation often includes clarifying roles, refining processes, adjusting decision checkpoints, improving measures, and strengthening enforcement mechanisms. It also means remediation must be designed with adoption in mind, because a fix that people cannot follow will fail in practice. A good remediation definition also includes the requirement of evidence, because leadership needs proof that remediation occurred and that it improved the control environment. When remediation is treated as an accountable governance deliverable, the enterprise can learn and improve rather than repeating mistakes. The first step in effective remediation is to distinguish between symptoms and root causes, because governance issues often present as operational pain but originate from decision design. For example, repeated outages may look like a technical reliability problem, but the root cause might be weak change governance, unclear service ownership, or an investment approach that underfunds resilience. Repeated compliance findings may look like a documentation problem, but the root cause might be missing ownership for controls, weak evidence generation in processes, or unclear decision rights for exceptions. Duplicated systems may look like a tooling problem, but the root cause might be unclear enterprise architecture direction, weak portfolio oversight, or incentives that reward local optimization. Governance remediation begins by asking what behavior the governance system allowed and what behavior it failed to require. That root cause lens keeps remediation from becoming a patch that leaves the underlying governance gap intact. Beginners sometimes want a single quick fix, but governance failures are usually system failures, and system failures require system adjustments. If remediation does not address the root cause, the enterprise may temporarily feel better, but the issue will return because the same decision conditions still exist. This root cause discipline is what prevents recurrence. Once root causes are understood, remediation must be prioritized, because enterprises cannot fix everything at once and governance must focus on what matters most. Prioritization means ranking issues based on impact, risk, urgency, and effort, while also considering external obligations and strategic direction. Issues that could lead to severe harm, major regulatory exposure, or enterprise-wide operational failure should receive higher priority because the cost of waiting is high. Issues that create chronic waste, like duplicated governance forums or overlapping controls, should also be prioritized when they undermine decision speed and consistency. Weak signals, such as a rising trend of exceptions or recurring confusion about ownership, should be treated as early opportunities for preventive remediation because it is cheaper to correct drift early than to respond after a crisis. For beginners, it helps to think of prioritization as choosing what to fix first, not what to ignore permanently, because lower priority items can still be addressed over time through a remediation roadmap. Governance prioritization also protects credibility. If leaders announce a remediation effort that is too ambitious and then fail to deliver, trust in governance declines. A focused set of remediation actions with clear outcomes builds confidence and creates momentum for continuous improvement. On the exam, answers that prioritize based on risk and enterprise impact often signal mature governance thinking. Ownership is central to remediation because every remediation item needs an accountable owner who has the authority to drive change across boundaries. That owner is not necessarily the person who will do all the work, but they must be accountable for ensuring the remediation is completed, validated, and sustained. Governance issues often span multiple teams, so the owner must be able to coordinate stakeholders, resolve conflicts, and escalate when necessary. For example, remediating unclear data ownership may require business leadership to define meaning and usage, IT leadership to implement controls, and compliance leadership to define evidence expectations. Without a clear owner, remediation becomes a group activity where everyone contributes, but no one is accountable, which is a reliable recipe for delay and partial completion. Governance frameworks often use action tracking and operating rhythm to enforce ownership, requiring owners to report progress and to explain blockers. Beginners sometimes assume assigning ownership is enough, but ownership must be paired with authority and resources or it becomes symbolic. Effective remediation includes verifying that the owner can actually influence the system changes required, such as adjusting processes, revising standards, or obtaining funding for improvements. This is how remediation becomes enforceable rather than aspirational. Remediation planning should specify what will change in the governance system, because vague plans lead to vague results. A strong plan defines the desired future state, such as a clarified decision right, a standardized process step, an updated checkpoint, or a defined ownership model for an asset. It also defines the practical deliverables, such as revised decision criteria, updated role responsibilities, improved evidence collection in a workflow, or a new review cadence for a particular governance outcome. Planning should include dependencies, such as needing stakeholder agreement on definitions or needing a shared service capability to support consistent control application. It should also include how the remediation will be validated, because governance needs proof that the change improved outcomes, not just that a document was updated. For example, if remediation aims to strengthen business case discipline, validation might include evidence that major funding approvals consistently include defined measures and benefit owners. If remediation aims to reduce uncontrolled exceptions, validation might include a measurable decline in undocumented exceptions and increased use of a formal exception process. Beginners should understand that remediation is not complete when the plan is written. It is complete when the changed governance behavior is visible. Planning, therefore, must be tied to monitoring and follow-through, which is where governance operating rhythm becomes essential. Closing governance gaps often requires adjusting decision structures and checkpoints, because gaps frequently exist in how decisions are made rather than in what people know. If a gap involves risk being accepted silently, remediation might include defining a checkpoint where certain risk levels must be escalated and documented, with clear decision rights. If a gap involves duplication of systems, remediation might include strengthening architecture review as part of funding decisions and requiring portfolio checks for overlap. If a gap involves weak accountability for information assets, remediation might include assigning data owners and creating a controlled process for changing definitions and approving access. These are governance system changes because they alter how decisions flow, not just how people behave in isolated moments. For beginners, It helps to recognize that changing decision flow is often more effective than issuing reminders, because reminders rely on memory and goodwill, while system design creates consistent behavior. Governance remediation should aim to redesign the path so that the safe, aligned choice is also the default choice. This is why remediation is often about process and structure rather than about speeches. When the enterprise changes the decision path, recurrence becomes less likely because the conditions that produced the failure have been removed or weakened. Controls and evidence practices are another frequent remediation target because many governance gaps are really control gaps that were never made operational. For example, a policy may require that access approvals are recorded, but the approval process may not actually capture and retain those records consistently. A policy may require periodic review of privileged access, but no one may be accountable for ensuring reviews occur and are evidenced. Remediation in these cases involves embedding evidence generation into the process, assigning control ownership, and defining review rhythm. Evidence also supports sustainability because it allows leaders to verify that the control continues to operate over time. Beginners sometimes interpret evidence as paperwork, but evidence is how governance proves that the remediated control exists and functions, especially when external scrutiny is possible. Effective remediation also considers control usability, because a control that is hard to follow will be bypassed, creating recurrence. Governance therefore aims to make controls practical and proportionate, often by standardizing and reusing controls through shared services where possible. When controls are designed and monitored as part of remediation, the enterprise not only closes a gap, but strengthens its ability to prevent similar gaps from appearing elsewhere. Preventing recurrence requires learning, and learning requires that remediation includes a feedback loop rather than ending with a one-time fix. The enterprise should ask what allowed the issue to persist, how it was detected, and what changes will make detection earlier next time. For example, if the issue was detected only after an audit finding, governance may need stronger internal monitoring and routine reviews to detect the weak signal earlier. If the issue was detected only after an incident, governance may need better risk indicators and more disciplined change oversight. If the issue was detected through stakeholder complaints, governance may need clearer communication and usability improvements so stakeholders can follow governance paths without friction. Remediation should therefore include updates to measures and review cadence that allow leaders to see whether the fix is working and to detect drift early. Beginners should understand that recurrence prevention is partly about strengthening the governance immune system, meaning the enterprise can sense problems earlier and respond consistently. That immune system includes operating rhythm, meaningful measures, and clear escalation paths for issues that exceed local authority. When remediation strengthens detection and response, similar failures become less likely and less severe. Culture and incentives also matter in remediation because governance gaps often persist because the enterprise rewards behaviors that undermine governance. If teams are rewarded only for speed, they may bypass controls and create exceptions that become recurring gaps. If leaders punish bad news, stakeholders may hide risks and delay escalation, allowing issues to grow. Effective remediation sometimes requires adjusting incentives, clarifying expectations, and reinforcing governance behavior through leadership action. This does not mean turning remediation into a culture campaign. It means recognizing when a governance gap is sustained by behavior patterns and addressing the environmental factors that shape those behaviors. For instance, if exception requests are high because standards are unrealistic, remediation may include updating standards to be achievable and improving shared services so compliance is practical. If governance forms are bypassed because they are slow, remediation may include streamlining decision checkpoints and defining service expectations for governance itself. Beginners should see that recurrence prevention is not only structural, it is also behavioral, because people will always find the path of least resistance. Governance remediation should therefore aim to make the desired behavior the easiest behavior, aligning processes, tools, and incentives so compliance is natural. When remediation accounts for culture and usability, fixes stick longer and require less constant enforcement. Validation is the step that confirms remediation actually closed the gap, because without validation, governance cannot be confident that the problem is solved. Validation can include checking whether the new process is being used, whether evidence is being produced, and whether measures show improvement in outcomes or conditions. It also includes confirming that responsibilities are understood and practiced, not merely written down. For example, if remediation assigned a new information owner, validation should include confirming that ownership decisions are being made and that data quality issues are being handled through the defined governance path. If remediation strengthened change oversight, validation should include whether risky changes are being reviewed properly and whether change-related incidents decline. Validation should also include checking for unintended consequences, such as whether a new checkpoint created a bottleneck that drives workarounds. Beginners sometimes assume validation is optional because the fix was implemented, but governance values evidence, and evidence is what turns remediation into an accountable outcome. Validation also supports learning because it reveals what worked and what still needs refinement. When remediation is validated and reviewed through operating rhythm, governance becomes a continuous improvement cycle rather than a series of isolated fixes. This is exactly how mature governance frameworks stay relevant and effective over time. To close, building issue remediation that closes governance gaps and prevents recurrence means moving from finding problems to changing the governance system so similar problems become less likely and less harmful. Effective remediation starts with root cause understanding, prioritizes based on enterprise impact and risk, assigns accountable owners with real authority, and defines clear changes to decision structures, processes, controls, and evidence practices. It treats recurrence prevention as a learning discipline, strengthening weak signal detection through meaningful measures and operating rhythm reviews, and addressing cultural and usability factors that can undermine compliance. It validates outcomes with evidence that the governance behavior has changed and that the enterprise is seeing improved alignment, reduced risk, or stronger value delivery. When remediation is done well, governance becomes trustworthy because it proves it can correct itself, and that self-correcting capability is essential in a world where technology, threats, and obligations constantly evolve. This is also the moment where governance earns credibility with stakeholders, because people see that issues lead to improvements rather than to blame or endless meetings.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.